He didn't say, "Bring that girl to me," because he wanted her. He said it because he'd watched her do something in that ballroom of 400 people that no one else had caught. Something that told him she was either the most dangerous person in the room or the only honest one. Severin Voss had come to the Aldergate to announce an alliance that would swallow half the coast. One glass of champagne and one girl in a borrowed uniform ended it before midnight. And by the time he understood what she had actually saved him from, the marriage was already a dead thing. The Aldergate ballroom was built to make men feel small, and Severin Voss had bought it precisely because it never worked on him. 2 stories of gold leaf climbed the walls toward a ceiling painted with saints, who had clearly never met anyone in the room. Chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, throwing hard white light across 500 glasses, 300 throats, and one long marble bar where the money of the eastern seaboard came to be seen bleeding into the money of the west. It smelled of hothouse lilies, warm candle wax, and the particular sourness of too many powerful people breathing the same air. Somewhere a string quartet sawed through something that was supposed to feel like elegance and mostly felt like a countdown. Severin stood at the center of it in a suit the color of wet slate, and he did not move. He had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of authority. Other men worked the room, shaking hands, laughing a beat too loud, leaning in. Severin let the room work its way toward him. He was tall, in a way that made people apologize for standing near him, with dark hair combed back off a hard forehead and eyes the flat gray of a knife left out in the rain. There was a stillness to his face that never quite resolved into calm. He looked like a man, listening for a sound the rest of them couldn't hear yet. "You're doing the thing again," Rourke murmured beside him, barely moving his lips. "What thing?" "The thing where you look like you're counting exits." Rourke lifted a glass of soda water. He had no intention of drinking. He was shorter than Severin, broader, with a boxer's flattened nose and a gaze that never stopped drifting across the crowd. He had been at Severin's shoulder for 11 years and had never once been thanked for it, which suited them both. "It's a party, boss. Try to look like a groom." "I'm not a groom yet." 2 hours, Rourke said. "Then you are." Severin's jaw tightened by a fraction no one else would have seen. Across the room, beneath a spill of white orchids that had cost more than most people at the gala earned in a month, Delphine Corvin was laughing at something a senator had said. She was extraordinary, in the cold, deliberate way of a diamond behind museum glass. Pale gold hair swept up off a long neck, a gown the exact silver of the chandeliers, a smile she could turn on and off like a lamp. She caught Severin watching and let the smile find him for a moment. And there was nothing behind it at all. That was what he respected about her. Delphine never pretended the thing between them was warm. It was a treaty. Her father's family owned the trucking corridors that ran up the spine of the coast. Severin owned the ports they ended at. A marriage stitched the two into a single artery that no rival could cut. 400 witnesses tonight, a signed arrangement in the morning, and by summer, no shipment moved between the water and the interior without a Voss and a Corvin, both taking a cut. They understood each other perfectly. Neither of them had ever said a word they didn't mean, because neither of them had ever said a word that mattered. It was, Severin had told himself, for 6 months, the cleanest thing he had ever built. He believed it right up until the moment it started to feel like a coffin. "Your uncle's asking after you," Rourke said, nodding toward the far end of the bar where a silver-haired man in an old-fashioned dinner jacket was holding court over a knot of Corvin cousins. "Wants to toast before the announcement. Id. Says it's tradition. Emmerich thinks everything's tradition if he does it twice." Severin's voice was dry, but his eyes went to the older man and stayed a second too long. Emmerich Voss had raised him after the fire took his parents, had taught him which men to trust and how far, had stood at every grave that mattered. Tonight he looked pleased in a way Severin couldn't quite place, the loose, satisfied pleasure of a man who had already been paid. Tell him I'll toast when there's something to toast. Rourke drifted off. Severin was alone in the middle of the noise, which was how he preferred it. And that was when the room did the thing it always did to him at these events. It flattened. The laughter turned to static. The faces smeared into a single glittering animal that wanted things from him. He felt the old familiar pressure build behind his eyes, and he did what he always did. He picked one point in the chaos and made it hold still. Tonight, the point he picked was the bar. He wasn't sure why. A server was moving down the length of it with a tray of champagne, and there was nothing about her meant to be seen. That was the first thing he noticed, that she had been built deliberately to not be noticed. Dark hair pulled back flat, a borrowed uniform a half size too large, sensible shoes. She moved through the crowd of glittering people like water, finding the spaces between stones, and not one of them looked at her, because she had made certain not one of them would. But Severin looked, and because he looked, he saw it. A man in a waiter's jacket. A man Severin did not recognize, and Severin made it his business to recognize the staff at any room he intended to spend 2 hours in, leaned across the service station, and with the small practiced motion of someone who had done it before, tipped something from a ring on his finger into a single flute of champagne. Then he set that flute at the front of the tray, alone, deliberately. The way you set a thing that is meant for one specific hand. Severin's pulse did not change. 20 years of this life had burned that reflex out of him. He simply watched, cold and precise, and understood in the space of a breath that the flute at the front of that tray was walking toward the Vos Corvin table, and that it was almost certainly walking toward him. And then the girl in the borrowed uniform reached the service station, picked up the tray, and, without breaking stride, without a flicker crossing her face, took the single flute from the front, set it down against the back rail behind a stack of linen. She did it in under a second. She did it so smoothly that the man with the ring never saw it happen. She did it like someone who had spent her whole life learning to make dangerous things disappear without anyone watching her hands. Then she lifted the tray, squared her shoulders, and turned toward the room, as if nothing at all had occurred. Severin realized he had stopped breathing. He did not know yet what had been in the glass. He did not know who she was, or who had sent the man with the ring, or whether the two of them were working the same side of the same knife. He knew only that a nobody in a too large uniform had just watched someone try to kill him and had quietly, expertly unmade it, and had done it as though it were the least interesting thing that would happen to her all night. Rourke reappeared at his elbow. "Boss, you've gone somewhere." Severin's eyes did not leave the girl. "That one," he said. His voice was very low and very even, the voice he used when a room was about to change temperature. The server with the tray, dark hair, by the ice. Rourke followed his gaze. "What about her? Bring that girl to me." They took her in a corridor behind the kitchens where the gold leaf gave way to bare service gray walls, and the music dropped to a rumor coming through the plaster. Marin Holt had been waiting for a hand on her arm all night. She just hadn't expected it to be a gentle one. Rourke didn't grab her. He stepped into her path, said, "Set the tray down, please," in a voice like a closing door, and something in the calm of it frightened her far more than force would have. She set the tray on a steel counter. She kept her hands where he could see them. She had learned, a long time ago and at a real cost, that the moment you look guilty is the moment they decide you are. "Am I fired?" she asked. "That depends," Rourke said, "on a conversation." The room they brought her to was small and windowless, a manager's office with a dead computer and a calendar 2 years out of date. Rourke stood by the door with his hands folded, which was worse than if he'd held a gun, because it meant he didn't think he'd need one. And then the door opened again, and the man from the ballroom walked in, the still one, the whole glittering animal of a crowd had been bending toward without seeming to. And Marin's stomach dropped straight through the floor, because up close she recognized exactly what he was. She had spent 2 years learning to read men like him, She had promised herself she would never be in a small room with one again. Severin Voss shut the door behind him and studied her the way a surgeon studies a scan, not cruelly. Worse than cruelly, completely. She felt herself being read. The flat pulled hair, the too large jacket, the shoes chosen for standing, the hands she was keeping so carefully in her lap. "You have a name," he said. It wasn't a question. "Marin. Marin Holt," she added, because volunteering the truth was sometimes the fastest way to hide the rest of it. "I'm agency. Third shift. If something's missing from the floor, I can promise you it isn't. Nothing's missing." He came a step closer. The office was too small for a man that size. "You took a glass off your own tray at the bar, front flute. You set it behind the linen and swapped it for another. Why, there it was. Not a question either." Marin had run the calculation 100 times in the 90 seconds since Rourke had stepped in front of her, and every branch of it ended the same way. He had seen. A man who saw that had eyes on him like a second nervous system, and a man with eyes like that did not survive by believing convenient answers. So she did the only thing that had ever kept her alive in a room like this. She told a version of the truth and buried the important part underneath it. "Because the man who poured it wasn't staff," she said. Something moved behind the gray eyes. "Not surprise. Recognition. Go on." "The staff here rotate through a briefing at 4 o'clock. Uniforms. Table map. The 2 allergies at the head table. I sat through it. That man wasn't in it. His jacket's the wrong cut. It's a size 40 off the coat rack. Ours are tailored at the shoulder because the agency's cheap about everything, except how we photograph." And he wore a ring on his pouring hand. She heard her own voice stay level, and was distantly proud of it. "You don't pour with a ring. It clicks the glass. Guests notice. Unless the ring is the point." The silence in the little office was total. Even the music had stopped, or she'd stopped hearing it. "So you saw a stranger with a ring set one glass at the front of a tray," Severin said slowly, "and instead of telling security, instead of screaming, instead of doing any single thing a frightened waitress would do, you made it disappear. Quietly, perfectly, as if you'd done it before." Marin said nothing. That was the part she could not explain, and they both knew it. "Where's the glass now?" he asked. "Behind the linen stack at the north end of the bar. Nobody's touched it." She swallowed. "You'll want it tested before someone dumps the ice." For a long moment, Severin Voss simply looked at her, and Marin looked back, because dropping her eyes would have been an answer too. Up close he was younger. Then the stillness had made him seem, and far more tired, with a thin white scar riding one eyebrow and a way of holding his shoulders like they'd been carrying something for years. He didn't look at her the way men in expensive rooms usually looked at a girl in a borrowed uniform. He looked at her like she was a locked door in a house he thought he owned. "Rourke," he said, without turning the glass. "Now. And find me the man with the ring." Rourke was gone before the sentence finished. Then it was just the two of them in the dead little office. And Severin took one more step, close enough that she could smell cedar and cold air, and something metallic underneath, and he lowered his voice to something almost gentle, which was the most dangerous thing it had done yet. "A frightened waitress runs," he said. "You stayed. You watched. You cleaned it up, and you carried your tray back into the room like nothing happened, and you'd have walked out of here at the end of your shift, and I'd never have known you existed." His gray eyes searched her face. "That's not instinct, Marin Holt. That's training. Somebody taught you to do that. So before I decide whether you saved my life tonight or set me up for someone who wants me to trust the pretty stranger who caught the knife." He stopped, tilted his head half an inch. "Who are you, really?" And Marin Holt, who had come to the Aldergate under a name that was almost hers, for a reason that had nothing to do with Severin Voss and everything to do with the man she'd spent 3 years learning to recognize, felt the floor of her whole careful plan begin to tilt, because the one man in the building she needed never to notice her was now the only one who ever had. The glass came back from the tester at 1:30 in the morning, and the number Rourke read off the little screen changed the shape of Severin's night. They had moved her by then. Not to a cell. Severin didn't have cells. He had rooms that people didn't leave until he wanted them to, but to a second-floor study in the Aldergate's private wing, a room of leather and dark wood that the hotel kept for men who paid to disappear for an evening. Marin sat in a wing chair with her hands folded in her lap and her spine off the backrest, and she had not asked for a lawyer, or a phone, or a glass of water, which Severin found more unsettling than if she'd asked for all three. Innocent people made demands. Guilty people made excuses. She did neither. She simply waited, the way he waited, and that similarity itched at him like a splinter under the nail. "Well," Severin said, when Rourke came in with the folded slip of paper. "Tell me what I drank." "You didn't drink anything, boss." Rourke's flattened face was grimmer than usual. "That's the point." He handed the slip over. "It's not a sedative. It's not a knock-you-out and question-you cocktail. It's an anticoagulant stacked on a cardiac agent. In that dose, with the champagne, you'd have made it through your own toast, felt fine. Then somewhere around the drive home your heart would have decided it was tired." He paused. "It's built to read as natural. A man your age, that much stress, a rich dinner. Nobody runs a talk screen on a heart attack at a wedding." Severin read the number twice. The room had gone very quiet and very cold, the way it always did when he understood something fully. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted him captured. They hadn't wanted leverage, or a confession, or a message sent. They had wanted him dead, cleanly tonight, in front of 400 witnesses who would all swear the great Severin Voss had simply had too much to drink and too much to carry. And they had wanted it to happen after the announcement, after the alliance was public, after the room had watched a Voss and a Corvin bind their houses, a groom who dropped dead the same night, a grieving bride, a widow's claim on everything the marriage had just joined. He set the paper down very carefully, because his hands wanted to do something else with it. He thought about the toast Emmerich had wanted, before the announcement, for tradition. He thought about how a toast puts a glass in every hand in the room and a reason to drink it, and how no one ever remembers which server brought which flute. It was elegant. It was patient. It was the work of someone who had watched him for a very long time and knew exactly how he moved through a room, which narrowed the list of people who could have designed it to a number Severin did not want to count. "Boss," Rourke said, watching him, "you're thinking it. I'm thinking it. The Corvins. Someone stood to inherit a merger tonight." Severin's voice was flat as poured concrete. "Not fight me for it. Not outbid me. Inherit it. You only inherit from the dead." Across the room, Marin shifted in the wing chair, a small movement, but he caught it, because he had started catching everything she did. She was listening. Of course she was listening. He'd let her stay in the room precisely to watch how she listened. And what he saw was that the word Corvin had done something to her face. Not fear. Something colder and more focused, like a hunting dog catching a scent it had been trained on years ago and never forgotten. He filed it. He said nothing. "Find the man with the ring," he told Rourke instead. "That's the other thing." Rourke's jaw worked. "He's gone. Walked off the floor 20 minutes after she swapped the glass, before we sealed the exits. But the staffing agency has a name and a photo on file for the shift, and, boss," he hesitated. And Rourke never hesitated. "It's a real man, real address. He just doesn't work galas. He works the loading docks at Pier 9. Severin went still. Pier 9 was Voss ground. Pier 9 was his. "So, he's one of ours. He's one of ours." The splinter under the nail became a nail through the palm. It wasn't just the Corvins then. To put a dockhand of Severin's own into a waiter's jacket at the Aldergate, someone had needed to know the staffing, the timing, the seating, needed to know it from the inside. Someone who could move a Voss man without Severin hearing the hinge turn, he thought, unwillingly, of a silver-haired man at the end of the bar, loose and satisfied, wanting to toast before the announcement, tradition. He shoved the thought down hard because it was too large to look at directly and turned instead to the thing in the room he could actually hold. "Leave us," he told Rourke. When the door shut, Severin crossed to the wing chair and crouched in front of it, so that for once he was looking up at her instead of down. Marin's eyes were the brown of strong tea, and they did not flinch from his. "You knew," he said quietly. "When Rourke said Corvin, something in you woke up. Don't tell me it didn't. I've spent 20 years learning to read exactly that. You didn't come to the Aldergate to pour champagne, Marinhold. You came because someone at that gala was worth the risk of you being seen. So here is where we are." He kept his voice gentle, which was how he kept it lethal. "A man of mine tried to kill me tonight. A woman I've never met stopped him and won't tell me why. And the only marriage I've ever agreed to just turned into a very expensive way for someone to make me a corpse." He leaned in half an inch. "I don't believe in the kind stranger who catches the knife by accident. I've never met her, so I'll ask you one more time, and then I'll stop asking nicely. Which one were you here for?" Marin looked at him for a long moment. And then she said the thing he was not expecting, in a voice so low he had to lean closer still to hear it. "I wasn't here for you," she said. "I didn't even know your name until Rourke said it in the corridor." Her hands folded in her lap had gone white at the knuckles. "But I know what was in that ring, and I know it because I've seen it kill someone before." Severin did not sleep that night. He sat in the dark study long after they'd taken Marin to a locked room down the hall. Locked, he told himself, for her protection, and did not examine the lie, and he turned the evening over and over like a stone he was trying to find the crack in. "I've seen it kill someone before." She wouldn't say who. She'd shut like a door the instant the words were out, as if she'd surprised herself by letting them go, and no amount of patience or pressure had opened her again. So, at first light, Severin did the only thing left to a man who couldn't get the truth from a person. He went looking for it in the places the person had been. He started with the agency file. Marin Holt had worked event staffing for 14 months. Clean record. Punctual. Requested the Aldergate shift specifically 3 weeks ago, and had traded another girl a double to get it. Home address: a block of walk-ups on Caraway Row, on the wrong side of the rail cut, where the city stopped pretending. Severin read the address twice, and felt the same cold he'd felt reading the Tox number, because Caraway Row was not where you lived if you were nobody. It was where you lived if you were hiding, and doing it on purpose, in the one part of the city where his people had no reason to walk, and his rivals had no reason to look. "You want a team," Rourke said when Severin told him where they were going. It wasn't quite a question. "I want you in the car, us. Caraway's not ours. It's not anybody's. That's the whole problem with it. Then no one will mind us visiting." The drive took them down out of the glass and stone of the harbor district, past the last of the good streetlights, over the rail cut on a bridge whose railing had been stripped for scrap, and into a part of the city Severin had spent his whole life arranging never to see. The buildings leaned, wires sagged between them like something exhausted. A dog with no collar watched the car pass with the flat professional interest of a creature deciding whether it was food. The rain from the night before had left everything slick and gray, and the morning light couldn't find the bottom of the streets. It just sat on the puddles, refusing to go deeper. Severin looked out the window and thought, unwillingly, about the way she'd kept her hands folded. He thought about the too large jacket, chosen not for size, but for how little of her it would let anyone see. He thought about the staff rotate through a briefing at 4 o'clock, the way she'd catalogued the room and the time it took most people to find the coat check. He'd taken it for training, and it was. But sitting in the car crossing into Caraway, he understood for the first time what training like that actually cost. You didn't learn to make a poisoned glass vanish in under a second in a classroom. You learned it because one day you hadn't been fast enough, and someone had drunk what you failed to catch. "I've seen it kill someone before." He kept coming back, As the streets got worse to a single detail he couldn't file. She'd said please, not last night. Last night she'd said nothing. She didn't have to. But in the corridor, when Rourke first stepped into her path, she'd said, "Set the tray down, please." Back to him, mirroring his own words. And Severin had watched it on the corridor camera afterward and understood it for what it was. It was a survival tic. Somewhere in her past, being polite had kept her alive. Being small and courteous and unmemorable had been the difference between a beating and a worse thing. You didn't learn manners like that at a dinner table. You learned them the way you learned to make a glass disappear, because the alternative had a cost you were still paying. He thought about the men who had taught her that, and his jaw set, and he did not yet have a name for them, but he intended to. The car stopped in front of a walk-up, the color of an old bruise. Severin got out into the cold and stood looking up at it, and Rourke came around the hood with his hand not quite near his coat. For a moment, neither of them moved. A curtain in a ground-floor window shifted, and a face looked out and looked at the black car and the two men in good coats, and withdrew. In a place like this, Severin thought, that was the only intelligence anyone gathered who arrived and whether to be somewhere else when they did. Marin had chosen to live surrounded by people who had learned not to see. It was the same instinct as the borrowed uniform. Disappear into a crowd of the deliberately blind. "Third floor," Rourke said, reading his phone. "Unit at the back." The street door had no lock worth the name. Inside, the hall smelled of damp plaster and fried onions, and the sharp chemical sweetness of the cheap stuff people used when they couldn't afford to actually be clean, only to smell like it. A child was crying, somewhere above them. The endless, exhausted crying of a child who had learned no one was coming. Severin climbed the stairs slowly, and each step felt like a sentence in an argument he was losing with himself, because with every floor, the truth about Marin Holt got harder to hold it the shape he'd wanted it in. Plant, assassin, pretty knife, sent by an enemy, and easier to see as something worse. Something that looked, the higher he climbed, more and more like a person who had been running from something for so long that hiding had become the only home she had. The door at the back of the third floor was reinforced. He noticed it the way he noticed everything. Now, a good deadbolt on a bad door, a wedge of wood cut to jam under it from the inside, the peephole scratched from being used too often. This was not the door of a woman who forgot to lock up. This was the door of a woman who lay awake, listening. He knocked, because he wasn't sure why, and no one answered, because of course no one did. She was locked in a room across the city. So Rourke put his shoulder to it, and the good deadbolt tore out of the bad frame, and the door swung open onto the one-room apartment where Marin Holt actually lived. And Severin Voss stepped inside and stopped, because the room told him in 10 seconds everything she had refused to say all night. There was almost nothing in it. That was the first blow, and it landed exactly where the empty apartment in his imagination would have. Except this was worse, because it wasn't empty. It was arranged. A single mattress on the floor, made with hospital corners, one chair, a camp stove on a milk crate, a row of tinned food stacked by size, the cheapest kind, rationed. Everything she owned could have gone into a single bag in under 2 minutes, and Severin understood at once that this was the point. That Marin Holt lived the way a person lives, when they have practiced many times, being gone before anyone arrives. And on the wall above the mattress, where a normal person would hang a picture, there was a map. Severin crossed the bare floor without breathing. It was a map of the Harbor District, his district, hand-marked in 3 colors of ink. Piers circled, warehouses numbered, routes traced in careful pencil, and gone over in pen where she'd been sure. There were photographs taped around the edges, printed cheap and curling at the corners. Trucks, gates, men he half recognized, a loading dock at night. And in the dead center of it all, ringed twice in red, was a name that stopped his heart the way the poison had been designed to. Not Voss. Corvin Naut. below the name, in small block letters, in a hand that pressed so hard it had nearly torn the paper. They killed him. Prove it. Severin stood in front of that wall for a long time. He had come here braced to find the evidence that she was a plant, a burner phone, a payment, a photo of himself, with crosshairs drawn on it. Instead, he had found a shrine to a grief and a war. One woman had been quietly, methodically, waging out of a room with a mattress on the floor and tinned food rationed by size. She had not come to the Aldergate for him. She had told the exact truth, and he had refused to hear it. She had come for the Corvins. And the poison in the ring, the poison she'd said she had seen kill someone before. He looked from the map, to the tins, to the reinforced door, and he understood with a cold falling sensation that whoever the Corvins had murdered to make this map, they had murdered with the same method they'd tried on him. A heart that simply got tired, a death nobody ran a screen on. She hadn't saved a stranger last night. She had recognized a killing she'd already survived once, and she had not been able to let it happen again in front of her. He made himself look at the map properly, the way she must have looked at it 1,000 nights. It was not the work of a grieving amateur. The routes were annotated with times. The warehouses carried little pencil notations of shift changes, of which gate camera pointed where, of which nights the manifests ran thin. She had reconstructed 3 years of a smuggling operation from the outside, with no access, no manpower, nothing but patience, and a dead man's 22 years of dinner-table complaints about a harbor she'd never been allowed to walk. Half of what was on that wall, Severin realized with a slow crawl of unease. He hadn't known himself, and he owned the harbor. She had seen the theft in his own house more clearly than he had, from a mattress on the floor across the rail cut, because she'd had a reason to look, and he'd had every reason not to. There was a corkboard section at the lower corner, and pinned to it were receipts, bus transfers, a pawn ticket, the careful paper trail of a person funding a private war on an event-staffing wage, spending nothing on herself so that every spare dollar could buy one more photograph, one more day of watching. He understood the tinned food now. He understood the single chair. She had not been poor by accident. She had been poor on purpose, the way a soldier travels light, so that nothing she owned could ever be used to hold her still. On the milk crate by the mattress, half under the edge of the thin blanket, something caught the gray light. Severin crouched and drew it out, a photograph in a cheap dime store frame, the only decorated object in the entire room. A man in his 50s, laughing, in a dockworker's coat, one arm around a girl of maybe 19, who had Marin's tea-brown eyes and a smile Severin had not yet seen her wear and now badly wanted to. On the back, in the same hard-pressed hand as the wall, Dad, Pier 9. The last good day. Pier 9. The dock hand in the waiter's jacket worked Pier 9. Severin closed his eyes. The pieces were turning, now sliding into an order he didn't like. The man with the ring was Voss, but he was Pier 9, and Pier 9 was where Marin's father had worked and died, and the Corvins were ringed twice in red on a dead man's daughter's wall. Whatever had happened on that pier had a Voss hand and a Corvin brain behind it, and Severin had spent the last 6 months of his life planning to marry into the second half of the thing that killed her father. Rourke's voice came from the doorway low. Boss, there's a car on the corner that's been idling since we came up. 2 men. They're ours. East Wing detail. But I didn't send them and neither did you. Severin didn't move for a moment. He was looking at the laughing man in the dockworker's coat. Then the second half of what Rourke had said landed, and it was colder than any enemy would have been. Our men, he said slowly, watching her building. Assigned by someone who isn't me and isn't you. He rose, sliding the framed photograph into his coat, and when he turned toward the door, his face had changed into something the Aldergate crowd would not have recognized. No stillness left in it now, only weather. Someone in my own house had eyes on Caraway Row before I ever heard her name, which means someone in my house knew exactly who Marin Holt was, and what she'd find, long before last night. "Get the car running," he said. "We're taking her home to my house, my wing, my detail, people I put there myself, before whoever posted those two decides she's worth collecting." And Rourke. He looked back once at the map, at the red ring, at the two hard-pressed words. Cancel the announcement. There's no marriage. There was never going to be a marriage. I just didn't know what I was really signing. They didn't take the bridge back. Rourke took the long way, doubling through the freight yards until he was certain the idling car hadn't followed. And by the time the gates of the Voss estate closed behind them, the gray morning had turned to hard, bright noon. Maren said nothing when they brought her out of the locked room and put her in the car. She said nothing when the estate rose up around her, all pale stone and old money. It was only when Severin set the dime store photograph down on the table in front of her, her father, laughing, the last good day, that something in her broke its moorings. She went very still. Then she reached out and turned it face down gently, the way you'd close the eyes of the dead. "You went to my apartment," she said. "I did. You had no right." "No," Severin agreed. He sat down across from her, close but not crowding, and for the first time since the corridor, he let her see that he was not going to perform authority at her. "Tell me about Pier 9. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't. Then she folded her hands on the table, the same way she always did, and she told him, in a flat voice, worn smooth from saying it only to herself in the dark. "My father worked the Pier 9 docks for 22 years. 4 men, the last 6. He was the kind of man who counted the crates twice because it was the right number, not because anyone was watching." A muscle moved in her jaw. 3 years ago the manifest stopped matching the holds. Weight, coming off the Corvin trucks, that wasn't on any paper. He asked about it. He was the sort of man who asked. And a week later, he had a heart attack in his own kitchen at 54, with no history, and the coroner signed it in under a minute because a dock worker's heart giving out is the least surprising thing in the world. She looked up and her tea-brown eyes were dry, which was worse than tears. "I found him. I did the compressions until the paramedics pulled me off. And 2 days later, at the funeral, a man I'd never met came and told me how sorry he was, and shook my hand, and I felt the ring." Severin went cold. "The same ring," he said. "I didn't know what it was then. I only knew it clicked against my father's coffin when the man touched it, and that his eyes were wrong, and that no one grieves a stranger by wearing jewelry to the wake." Her voice didn't shake. That was the thing about her. The not shaking was the loudest sound in the room. "It took me a year to learn what a ring like that does. Another year to put a name to the man who wore it at the wake. A dockhand off your own Pier 9. A nobody who does the quiet errands nobody wants traced back. I finally got a photograph of him 3 weeks ago, and I traded a girl, a double shift, to work the Aldergate the moment I heard he'd be moving through it as staff. I wanted to stand in a room and watch his face while he thought he was safe." She let out a breath. "I never got the chance. I recognized him the second he walked in, and then I watched him tip the ring into a glass and set it at the front of a tray. And I knew exactly what it was, and I knew someone was about to die of a tired heart in a room full of people who'd never question it. And she stopped. "I couldn't stand in another room and watch it work. Not again. So, I made it disappear. I wasn't saving you. I didn't know you. I was stopping him. I was 3 years too late to stop him the first time." She looked away. "What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known from a photograph of an errand boy, was who he answered to, who put him in that jacket, whose hand was behind his." The silence after that was enormous. Severin understood now, completely, and the understanding sat in him like a swallowed stone. The Corvins hadn't started skimming the harbor last night. They'd been bleeding weight off Pier 9 for years. Pier 9, his pier, under his own uncle's watch. And when an honest foreman noticed, they'd stopped his honest heart with a ring and filed it under nothing. The marriage wasn't the beginning of the theft, it was the cover for it. Bind the houses, put a Corvin hand on the harbor legally, and every crate that had ever gone missing became a rounding error. Inside a partnership, no one would audit. And the groom was only useful for exactly as long as it took the ink to dry. Then, the same ring, the same tired heart, the same coroner too bored to run a screen. They were going to do to me, Severin said slowly, exactly what they did to your father. Yes, with the same hand. Yes. Why didn't you take it to anyone? Severin asked, still not turning. 3 years. You built a case on that wall that half my accountants couldn't build. Police, a newspaper, a rival who'd have loved the ammunition. Anyone, to whom, it wasn't quite a question. It was tired. The coroner already signed it. The docks are yours, which means the police, who work the docks, are yours, which means they were, without knowing it, Emmerich's. And a rival family taking my father's death to war wouldn't have been justice. It would just have been. My father used one more time, by one more powerful man, for a reason that had nothing to do with him. She looked down at her hands. He counted crates twice because it was the right number. I wasn't going to let his name become somebody's leverage. I wanted the truth on a piece of paper that couldn't be spun. I wanted the man who wore the ring to know I knew. That's all. That's the whole war. It was never going to end with anything but me looking at him across a room, so he'd understand that somebody saw Severin was quiet for a moment, and instead, you saw him tip it into a glass for me. And instead, she agreed, I had to choose, in about half a second, between finally getting to watch his face and stopping the thing that killed my father from killing a man I'd never met. Her mouth twisted. I chose the way my father would have. It's a terrible habit. It's gotten no one in my family anything but buried. He stood up. He walked to the tall window and looked out at the pale grounds, and Marin watched the broad line of his back and understood that she had just handed the most dangerous man she'd ever met the one thing he'd been missing, which was a reason. There's more, she said to the window, and you already know it, or you wouldn't have gone quiet at the word Pier 9 last night. She waited until he turned. A dockhand doesn't get into a size 40 jacket at a sealed gala on his own. Somebody inside your house dressed him and pointed him at the right glass. Somebody who knew the seating and the timing, and that you'd never check a face you'd already decided was staff. Her eyes held his. And somebody inside your house had 2 of your own men parked outside my building this morning, before you'd even said my name out loud. I don't know his name, Mr. Voss. But you flinched. So you do. The phone rang while they were still looking at each other. Severin drew it from his coat, glanced at the screen, and something in his face closed like a fist. He held Marin's gaze as he answered, and he put the call on the room so she could hear it, which she understood, even through the fear, as a kind of trust she had not earned and did not know what to do with. Delphine Corvin's voice came through cool and faintly amused, the voice of a woman who had never once been told no. You disappeared from your own gala. People are talking. My father is furious. He's been on with the officiant and the caterer and half the coast, trying to understand why the announcement never came. A pause. Precisely waited. Where are you? Handling a staffing problem, Severin said. A staffing problem. The amusement thinned. Darling, we have 300 people expecting a signing this afternoon. Whatever the little crisis is, hand it to someone else and come home. The photographer alone is costing us by the hour. Severin looked at the overturned photograph on the table, at the woman across from him who had done compressions on her own father's chest, until strangers pulled her off. At 3 years of a war, fought out of a room with a mattress on the floor, there's not going to be a signing, Delphine. The line went quiet. When she spoke again, the cool was gone, and under it was something Severin had never heard from her before. Not hurt, he'd have understood hurt. Calculation. Fast, frightened calculation. You don't get to cancel this. Do you understand what my father has already put in motion? The corridors are being retitled, Severin. There are papers. This isn't a dinner reservation. Then tell your father The papers are worth exactly as much as the glass someone left at the front of a tray last night, Severin said, and heard her breath stop. Tell him the champagne came back from the lab this morning. Tell him I know what a bored coroner will sign without looking, and I know the name of the peer, and I know whose hand wore the ring 3 years ago at a dockworker's funeral. His voice never rose. That was the terrible part. Tell him the marriage is off. The harbor is closed to Corvin Waite as of this minute, and if I see one of your trucks on my side of the rail cut, I will not send it back empty. Severin. For the first time in 6 months, Delphine Corvin sounded her age. Severin, whatever you think you found, you are making a catastrophic. There is no announcement, Delphine. The words came flat and final. The period at the end of the whole arrangement. No signing. No merger. No marriage. There's a girl. Your family should have been far more careful about killing. And there's a coroner's file your family should have burned when they had the chance. Don't call me again. He ended the call and set the phone down with great care. The way you set down something you'd like to throw. Marin was staring at him. You just declared war on the family that owns half the coast, she said, over a stranger in a borrowed uniform. No. Severin's gray eyes came to her and there was no stillness left in them at all. I declared war on the family that killed a man for counting crates honestly and was about to do it to me for signing my name. You're not the reason, Marin. You're just the one who turned the light on. He picked up the overturned photograph and set it upright again, facing her. Now, you said somebody in my house dressed that dockhand and posted men outside your door. I want you to help me find out who. And then I'm going to burn the whole thing down to the pilings. They gave her a room in the east wing, and Marin stood in the middle of it for a full minute, unable to make her body believe it was real. It was larger than her entire apartment. The bed alone could have slept 4. There were towels folded like architecture and a window that looked out over ground so green they seemed printed, and Marin stood in the doorway of it with her 2-minute life packed into no bag at all and felt, absurdly, like weeping, not from relief but from the vertigo of being somewhere that assumed she'd still be alive tomorrow. She had not let herself assume that in 3 years. Planning a future was a luxury for people who weren't waiting for a car on the corner. That was where Severin found her an hour later. Not lying down, not resting, but sitting bolt upright in the reading chair by the window with the lights off, watching the drive. Victor says you haven't eaten, he said from the doorway. Victor was the estate's doctor, whom Severin had summoned to look her over the moment they arrived, and who had come back to Severin with a quiet, furious report. Old fractures healed crooked, a wrist that had been broken and never set right, a body run for years on tinned food and vigilance. He also says there's an old scar on your forearm you didn't want him to see. Marin pulled her sleeve down without thinking. It's old. Most of them are. Severin came in and sat on the edge of the bed, at a careful distance, and for a while he didn't say anything at all, which she was learning was how he said the things that mattered. Who hit you? Marin? She almost lied. It was the reflex of a decade. But she was tired in a way that went past her body, and the room was dark, and this terrible calm man had just torn up half the coast without once asking her to be grateful for it. And so she told him the last thing. The thing under all the other things. After my father died, I couldn't let it go. Everyone told me to. My mother begged me to. She looked out at the drive. So the Corvins sent someone to warn me off. Not to kill me. A second dead halt in a year would have been a pattern, and they're careful about patterns. Just to warn me. He made sure it hurt enough to remember, so that I'd understand that grief had an acceptable size, and mine was over it. Her voice was perfectly level. It didn't work the way they wanted. It just taught me to be quiet, to be small, to make dangerous things disappear before anyone saw my hands. Everything you noticed in that ballroom, every skill you called training, I learned it from the men your fiancé's family sent to keep me from asking the questions my father asked. Severin sat very still, in the dark. When he spoke, his voice had gone somewhere low and dangerous. Say the name. I don't have a name. He wore gloves. She turned from the window at last and looked at him. But he wore a watch. Heavy, gold, with a cracked crystal on the face, because he never took it off, not even to work. I looked at that watch a great deal, those 2 evenings, because it was easier than looking at his face. She swallowed. If I ever see that watch again, I'll know the man wearing it in the dark. For a moment, Severin didn't move. Then he rose, crossed to her chair, and did something neither of them expected. He crouched down in front of her, so that the man who made rooms bend toward him was looking up, and he took her wrong-heeled wrist in both his hands as gently as if it were still broken. "You spent 3 years alone," he said, "fighting the family I was about to marry into, getting beaten quiet by men I never bothered to notice, living on tins so you could keep a map on your wall and a promise to a dead man. And last night you looked at a glass meant for a stranger and you couldn't stand to lose him too." His thumb moved once over the old break. "Featherlight. You did the largest thing anyone's ever done for me. And you did it for free. And you didn't even want me to know your name. Do you understand how far outside my experience that is? I didn't know people did things for reasons that weren't owed." Marin was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its careful level for the first time. "You want to know the worst part? It's not the ribs. It's not the wrist. It's that after a while I started to think they were right. That grief did have a size, and mine was indecent, and if I'd just been reasonable, if I'd just let a 54-year-old man's tired heart be a tired heart, I'd have a normal life, a flat with more than one chair, friends who could come over, a door I didn't have to jam." She touched the sleeve she'd pulled down over the old scar, as though she could feel it through the cloth. "They didn't just teach me to be quiet, Severin. They almost taught me to be ashamed of the one thing about me that was worth anything. That I loved him enough to be inconvenient about it." "You weren't inconvenient." Severin's voice was rough. "You were right. There's a difference, and every powerful man alive would like you to forget it. Because a person who's right and won't stop is the only thing we're actually afraid of." He was still crouched in front of her. "You frighten me more than the Corvins do. Do you understand that? The Corvins want money. I've spent my whole life handling men who want money. You want the truth on a piece of paper that can't be spun, and you were willing to live in a box for 3 years to get it. I don't know how to buy that. I don't know how to threaten it. I've never in my life met a thing I couldn't buy or threaten, until I looked up from a poisoned glass and saw you carrying a tray." "Don't," Marin whispered. "Don't make it into something. I can't afford it to be something. It's already something." He stood, still holding her ruined wrist, and drew her up out of the chair. "Now come eat, before Victor has both our heads. And then you're going to look at photographs until we find a heavy gold watch with a cracked face. Because whoever wears it dressed a dockhand in a waiter's jacket last night and posted 2 of my men outside your door. And I want him before the Corvins. Remember to be careful about patterns." She found the watch at 3 in the morning. They'd been at it for hours by then, side by side at the long table in Severin's study. The estate, silent around them but for the grandfather clock in the hall. Rourke had brought box after box, personnel files, surveillance stills, the Gala's own security footage pulled frame by frame, and Marin went through them the way she did everything, quietly, thoroughly, missing nothing. Severin sat beside her and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he liked the silence between them. It wasn't the flattening static of the ballroom. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill a room to survive it. He poured her coffee at some point, black, because she'd told him that was how she took it, and then poured himself the same, and neither of them remarked on the fact that they took it identically. He watched her hands as she worked, careful, unhurried, and thought about the wrist and about the men he was going to visit for it. "You should sleep," he said. "Near 2. So should you. I don't much." She turned a photograph over. "We're a poorly matched pair for a rest cure." He almost smiled. It was a strange sensation, and he distrusted it, and he let it happen anyway. "Tell me something that isn't about them." He said, "One thing." "Anything." Marin glanced at him, wary of the question the way she was wary of everything soft. Then she said, "I can name any bird by its call. My father taught me, before the docs ate all his time. We used to sit on the fire escape, and he'd quiz me." Her mouth did something that was almost a smile and hurt to look at. "It's a useless skill. There aren't many birds on Caraway Row." "There are on my grounds," Severin said. "In the spring you can't hear yourself think." She looked at him for a moment too long, and something passed between them that neither named. And then she looked quickly back down at the photographs because naming it was more frightening than any car on any corner. "Can I ask you something?" she said to the photographs. "You canceled a marriage that would have doubled your reach. You've turned a family that owns the corridors into an enemy. In the morning, every man who works for you is going to want to know why the Great Alliance died overnight. And the true answer is, a waitress. That's not a reason a man in your position can afford to give." She turned a still over without seeing it. "So, why did you do it before you had any of this? You canceled the announcement standing in my apartment, before you knew about Emmerich, before any of it made you safer, when you thought I might still be a plant. Why?" Severin considered the question honestly, which surprised them both. "Because, for 6 months I'd been telling myself the cleanest thing I ever built was a marriage where neither of us meant a word," he said. "And then I stood in a freezing room with one chair and a map on the wall, and I understood that you'd meant every single thing you'd ever done, at a cost I couldn't imagine paying, for a man who was already dead and couldn't thank you. And I couldn't go back and sign my name next to Delphine's. After that, not because of you. Exactly. Because you made the thing I'd built look like what it was." He met her eyes. "A coffin I'd chosen. I just needed someone to stand in a colder room to see it." Marin didn't have an answer for that. She looked back down. And that was when she went very still in the particular way he'd learned, found it. She turned the still toward him. It was a frame from the Gala's service corridor, time-stamped 40 minutes before the toast that never happened. 2 men, half in shadow. One was the dock hand in the too large jacket, the ring man, the one she'd photographed at her father's funeral 3 years ago and come to the Aldergate to finally see. The other stood with his back mostly to the camera, handing the dock hand something small, and on the wrist that did the handing, catching the corridor light, was a heavy gold watch with a spider crack across the face. Marin's voice had gone to a whisper. "The watch. Severin, that's the watch. The man who came to my apartment. The gloves. The 2 evenings. That's his watch. He's here." He was standing right behind the man with the ring the whole time. She couldn't finish the sentence. Her hand had gone to her wrist without her noticing. Severin took the photograph from her hand very slowly. He did not need her to finish it. He was looking at the sliver of the second man's face that the frame had caught, the line of a jaw he had known his whole life, the set of shoulders that had stood at every graveside that ever mattered to him, the old-fashioned cuff of a dinner jacket worn to a gala for tradition. The room went utterly cold. "Boss." Rourke had come to the door with a fresh box and stopped when he saw Severin's face. "Boss, what is it?" Severin set the photograph down in the pool of lamplight and turned it so Rourke could see, and Marin watched 2 hard men look at the same picture and go equally, terribly, quiet. "That's Emmerich's watch," Rourke said finally very low. "The crack. He dropped it off a boat 10 years ago, never replaced it, said a scar's just a story you survived." He looked up. "Boss, that's your uncle handing the ring man his orders." Severin didn't answer at once. He was thinking of a silver-haired man at the end of a bar, loose and satisfied, wanting to toast before the announcement. Tradition. He was thinking of the man who'd raised him after the fire, taught him which men to trust and how far, and who had, it turned out, been quietly selling the harbor out from under him to the Corvins for years, skimming Pier 9, and had planned to finish the sale by planting a ring in his nephew's champagne the moment the marriage made the theft legal, and the widow made it permanent. Emmerich, had posted the men on Caraway Row, and Emmerich had gone to a grieving girl's apartment himself, 3 years ago, with his own gloved hands, not sent an enforcer, because an enforcer can be traced, and turned, and made to talk, and the one thing Emmerich never delegated was the measuring of a threat. He'd needed to look at Maren Holt with his own eyes and decide how much she knew and whether she'd stay quiet. He'd decided wrong. It had all been one hand the entire time, and it had tucked Severin in at night. And Maren, watching him, understood the exact size of what he'd just lost, because she'd lost the same shape of thing herself, and she did the only thing she knew how to do with that kind of wound. She reached over and for the first time put her hand over his. Then she looked back at the photograph, and something in the timestamp snagged her. Wait, her finger hovered over the corner of the frame. This is 40 minutes before the toast. But the man with the ring didn't tip anything into a glass until the toast was nearly called. I watched him do it. So, whatever your uncle is handing him here, it isn't the poison. The poison came later, she frowned. What did he give him this early? Severin took the photograph back and looked at the small shape in the dockhand's hand, and the cold deepened. A key. That's a gatecoat, a magnetic pass for the pier gates. He set it down slowly. He wasn't only planning to kill me at the gala. He handed off the pier keys the same night, because the loadout was scheduled for the same window. Dead groom, empty harbor, both before sunrise. 2 hands, 1 night. He looked at her. He wasn't improvising. Maren, he'd been ready for months. The only thing that broke a plan that clean was a waitress, who took the wrong glass off her own tray, she finished. Then she turned back to the boxes, and a moment later she went still again, and this time it was worse. He's already at Pier 9, she said quietly. She'd found it under the dispatch logs. A truck manifest, a 4 a.m. Window, wind, moves. Tonight. That's what the key was for. He's going to load out everything he skimmed and be gone across the rail cut before you wake up. And he thinks you're dead in the back of a car, somewhere between the Aldergate and here. Her fingers tightened. He doesn't know you found the glass. He doesn't know I lived. Severin. He doesn't know you're coming. Severin looked down at her hand on his for a long moment. Then he turned it over and held it. No, he said. He doesn't. Pier 9 at 4 in the morning smelled of brine and diesel and rust, exactly as it had the day Maren's father last counted crates on it, though neither of them said so. Severin came in dark and quiet, the way he did everything. Rourke and 6 men flowed out of the shadows of the container stacks around him, and they moved without speaking, because Maren, who had refused, flatly and without drama, to stay behind, and whom Severin had stopped arguing with the moment he understood arguing was pointless, had drawn them the pier from memory. She knew every camera's blind spot. Her father had complained about all of them at the dinner table for 22 years. At the mouth of the pier, where the container stacks gave onto open concrete, Severin stopped them with a raised hand and stood a moment in the dark, listening. He could hear the low diesel idle of the trucks, the scrape of crates, a man laughing at something. It was the sound of people who believed they were unobserved, and it was the most dangerous sound in the world to make in front of Severin Voss. Beside him, Maren had gone somewhere very quiet and very far, and he glanced at her and understood that she was standing on the exact ground where her father had spent 22 years, on the night she'd been waiting 3 years to see, and that whatever happened next, she had already survived the worst version of it 1,000 times in her head. "Stay behind the crane housing," he murmured to her. "Whatever you see. If it goes wrong, Rourke's second man walks you out the north gate, and you disappear the way you know how. And you don't look back. Promise me." "I don't make promises I intend to keep," Maren said, which was not a yes, and Severin, to his own surprise, almost smiled in the dark. The loading doors of Warehouse 9 stood open, throwing a wedge of hard sodium light across the wet concrete. Inside, under that light, a line of unmarked trucks sat waiting, and men in Corvin colors were walking crates up the ramps, crates that should have been on Voss manifests and weren't, 3 years of skimmed weight loading out under cover of a wedding that would have made it all legal by morning. And in the middle of it, silver hair bright under the sodium lamps, a heavy gold watch with a cracked face on his wrist, stood Emmerich Voss, drinking coffee from a paper cup and watching other men do the carrying. Beside him, uneasy, hovered the dockhand from the Gala, the ringman, still in his own clothes now, kept close where Emmerich could see him, because a tool that has served its purpose is also a tool that can talk. Severin stepped into the wedge of light. He didn't shout. He simply walked into the open, out of the dark, and let the first Corvin man to see him drop his crate and go for his gun, and let Rourke's people, from the black above the containers, make certain that gun was never raised. It was fast, and it was quiet, and it was over in the time it took Emmerich to turn around and see, standing in the light where a dead man should have been, the nephew he had poisoned. The ringman bolted at the first suppressed cough of gunfire and made it 4 steps before Rourke's people put him on the concrete, alive, hands behind his head. The one man on the pier Severin wanted breathing, because a coroner's file needed a voice to reopen it. The paper cup fell out of Emmerich's hand. Severin. His face did a terrible thing. A whole life of practiced warmth collapsing into naked math. Severin, thank God. I thought they told me you'd been taken. I've been trying to reach. Don't. Severin's voice was very quiet, and it stopped the old man like a wall. You dropped your watch off a boat once and kept the crack, because a scar is a story you survived. You told me that when I was 9. I believed everything you ever told me. He took a step closer. There's a camera in the service corridor at the Aldergate, Uncle. It caught the story you didn't survive. Emmerich's eyes flicked. Once to the woman standing at the edge of the light, small, dark-haired, still. And Severin saw the exact moment the old man recognized her, not from the Gala, but from before. From 2 evenings with gloves on, her, Emmerich breathed, and the warmth was entirely gone now. The Holt girl. You brought the Holt girl into this. He laughed an ugly, frightened sound. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away for a dockworker's brat? The Corvins own the corridor's boy. I gave them the harbor because the harbor was already lost. I was saving the family. I was getting us out before. You murdered her father for counting crates, Severin said. You beat her quiet when she grieved too loud. You put a ring in my glass, and you were going to let a bored coroner call it a tired heart, and then you were going to stand at my funeral and wear that watch. He was very close now. You taught me which men to trust and how far. You just forgot to leave yourself off the list. Emmerich went for the gun in his coat. He was old and slow, and Severin had known him his whole life. He knew the tell in the shoulder before the hand even moved. Severin didn't fire. Rourke did, 1 shot, and it was over. The heavy gold watch with the cracked face slipped from Emmerich's wrist and hit the wet concrete of Pier 9, and cracked the rest of the way, and the man who had worn it did not reach for it again. The warehouse went silent. The surviving Corvin men had already put their weapons down. Marin walked forward slowly, out of the edge of the light, and stood over the body of the man whose watch she had memorized in the dark 3 years before. She didn't gloat. She didn't weep. She simply looked, for a long moment, at the cracked gold face. And then she crouched, and picked it up, and closed her fist around it. And Severin understood that she wasn't taking a trophy. She was taking back the last thing she'd been forced to look at instead of her own fear. Load it all back, Severin told Rourke without looking away from her. Every crate. It's Voss weight. It goes back on Voss paper. Keep the ringman breathing. And somewhere quiet. He's going to say all of it, on a recording. And a coroner's file is going to reopen. And the trucks. He glanced at the Corvin colors. Drive them to the rail cut, and leave them on the far side, keys in them, doors open. Let the Corvins find their own weight sitting on their own line with nowhere to go. Tell them the harbor is closed. Tell them the foreman's daughter says the Count came up short. Dawn came gray and clean over the estate, and for the first time in 3 years, Maren Holt watched a sunrise without also watching the drive. She was in the study window when Severin found her, the cracked gold watch sitting on the sill in front of her, where she'd set it down, not hidden, not clutched, just set down, which he understood to be its own kind of victory. He came and stood beside her, with 2 cups of black coffee, and handed her one, and they drank in the silence that had stopped being dangerous somewhere around 3 that morning. "Richard Corvin called," Severin said eventually. "Delphine's father. He wanted to talk about the corridors, about being reasonable. What did you tell him? That reasonable men don't put rings in champagne, so we had nothing to discuss." He sipped his coffee. "The harbor's closed to them. The papers are ash, and the ring man is talking. Enough that a coroner, 3 years too late, is going to reopen a file with your father's name on it and sign it differently this time." He paused. "Delphine's already left the coast. Whatever held her to the arrangement, it wasn't me, and it wasn't loyalty. It was the merger, and the merger's dead. I imagine she'll land somewhere expensive." Maren turned the coffee cup in her hands. "And me?" It was the question under all the questions, and she asked it looking at the watch on the sill instead of at him, because 3 years of tinned food and locked doors had taught her that hope was the most expensive thing there was, and she had never once been able to afford it. Severin set his cup down. He reached over, and very gently, turned her by the shoulder until she had to look at him. "You," he said, "are not going back to Caraway Row." "There's no Caraway Row to go back to. I had the lease bought out and the map taken down and framed because it's the record of a war. You won, and you're going to want it someday when this doesn't feel real." His gray eyes didn't waver. "Your father's grave is being moved to the good cemetery on the hill, the one with the wall around it at my expense, and the stone is going to say Foreman, Pier 9, because he was the last honest man who ever stood on it, and the harbor should remember. And you," his voice dropped, "you are done disappearing. You are done being small, so that dangerous men don't see your hands. I saw your hands, Maren. I've never been able to stop looking at them." "I don't know how to be seen," she whispered. "I forgot how. Maybe I never knew. Then we'll be a poorly matched pair for that too." He took her hand, the one with the wrong-heeled wrist, and held it against his chest, over the steady living beat of the heart that a ring had been built to stop. "I spent my whole life certain nobody would ever do a thing for me they weren't paid for. You proved me wrong before you even knew my name. I'm not putting you back in the shadows, Maren Holt. I'm putting you here, beside me, where I can see you." She was quiet for a moment, her palm still flat against his chest, feeling the beat under it. "You know what the strange thing is," she said. "For 3 years I was so afraid of being seen. Being noticed was how people in my family ended up dead. My father got noticed for asking the wrong question about the wrong manifest. I got noticed for grieving too loud. Every skill I have is a skill for not being there." She looked up at him. "And the one time it mattered, the one time, being invisible, would have kept me alive and safe and out of all of this. I stepped out of the shadow on purpose, in front of the most dangerous man in the room, because I couldn't watch it happen again. I broke my own only rule. And it's the first thing in 3 years I don't regret." "That's not strange," Severin said. "That's the whole thing. You spent all that time learning to disappear, and when it counted, you chose to be seen. And it cost you everything you'd built to protect yourself." His hand tightened over hers. "So no, you don't go back in the shadows. You earned the light the hard way. I'm not going to be one more man who makes you dim yourself to survive me." Maren looked at the terrible gentle man who had torn up half the coast and buried his own uncle for her, and felt the last locked door she'd been holding shut for 3 years. Finally, quietly, "Give." "Okay," she said. "Okay." A breath. And then, because she was still herself, still the girl who counted crates twice because it was the right number, She added, but the count on your East warehouse is off by 4 pallets, and your night manifests don't reconcile. And if I'm staying, I'm fixing your books, because whoever's been keeping them should be fired into the sea. Severin Voss laughed. A real one, rough and startled. The first in longer than he could remember, and drew her in, and pressed his lips to her forehead, and held her there in the clean grey light, while the birds, she could name by their calls, started up in the trees she'd never had. Outside, the harbor was his again. Inside, for the first time, it belonged to someone worth protecting. And that is how a girl in a borrowed uniform, carrying a tray no one was supposed to notice, brought the most dangerous man on the coast to his knees. Not with a knife, but by being the one honest thing in a room built for lies. If you made it to the end of this one, do me a favor. Marin spent 3 years being invisible on purpose, living small, keeping her hands out of sight, waiting for a car on the corner that never stopped coming. And it took a poisoned glass and a man who actually looked for her to finally be seen. That's the part I can't stop thinking about, how the quietest person in the room was the only one who saw everything. So tell me down in the comments the moment Severin said, "Bring that girl to me." Did you think she was the assassin, the bait, or the one thing that would save him? I read every guess. If this story hit you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share it with the one person you know who always notices what everyone else misses. I'll see you in the next one.